This time on So What, I'm going to do some knitting instead of some sewing, and you're going to see a little bit of car work as well, because I realised I have two really good props outside, so we'll do a bit of that. This is a vintage knitting pattern. I'm just looking for it. It is this one from Patons Baldwin. I'm not sure the date of the pattern. It's pre-decimalisation, so it's pre-72. Editing me will correct that if that's wrong. And it's not a bad pattern, but it does have some problems, which I'll go into in the rest of the video. The garment, once it's made up, is perfectly fine. It's very colourful, as you can see, and this is made entirely from leftover yarn from other projects. So your usual method of doing a sample patch to figure out your stitch tension distance, that sort of business, doesn't really work on this. So it's a bit of guesswork, and it's fine for what I want it for. I wanted to make something that was just something I could throw on, I could put in the washing machine. I didn't need to worry about it if it got damaged. I can repair it in the future, because I just wanted something that's going to keep my clothes a little bit cleaner and keep me warmer when I'm working outside on the cars. So without further ado, let's get into the video. It's a slightly different format this time, so let me know if you like it. On with the show. Here's our ingredients for this little project. This is all wool, well, acrylic yarn left over from various different projects that I've been doing over the years. The big ball of black is completely untouched. That's a WI special from Hobbycraft. And all the rest is just various ages. I'd already done most of the front before I started doing these videos, because I wasn't sure if I was going to record this. So what you're seeing there is most of the front of this garment. And a bit of a close-up on the knitting itself. The yarn I'm using is various different thicknesses, which isn't ideal. It's not the way that you're supposed to do it. They're all supposed to be the same, but they're close enough. Some of them knit nicer than others. That fluffy stuff is a nightmare, and the black's very grabby. And you can see there's my stitch keeper for the other arm I need to do. And here's some of the different yarns that I'm using. So let's have a closer look at the pattern itself. And this is number 698. It was 6p, or 6 old pence. And it's various pullovers and jumpers and waistcoats. And this is just a pattern I picked up off eBay. It wasn't very much. It's an original, not a reprint. And it was just a case of picking out which one I liked, and hopefully being happier than her. Didn't really like the waistcoat. Not my sort of thing. I don't really like knitted waistcoats that much. We're going to go with this one, the classic pullover. I do have enough material to do sleeves, but I want to make a sleeveless one for this. So we're going with the pattern on the right there. That's a lot of brill cream. I quite like this one, which is a cable knit. I might make this one in the future. Labrador not included. And I like the pattern on this one, but it's a bit fiddly for what I'm doing here. It would have been a bit too busy. That's even more brill cream. Plenty of instructions on options and pocket types and all that sort of thing. So we will need some number 7 needles, some number 9 needles, and some Patons Baldwin, which obviously I don't have. I couldn't even find a picture of what that should look like, so it was all a bit of a guess. The tension on this, when I did the sample, knitted up as it says there, but the actual garment knitted up very narrow on the first attempt. So I made some pattern adjustments.
here we go. This is me doing some of the knitting and struggling to find where the needle is. It was quite a challenge recording knitting. It's not something I've done before, and it was quite tricky to figure out where to put the camera, because the camera obviously wanted to be where my head is. So I had another go. You can see my teapot just creeping into shot there. The row I'm working on here is just the plain black acrylic, and the little yellow one there, that's the colour for the next stripe. And it was taking around about 3 minutes a row, I would say. I had to increase the width of the pattern by 10 stitches. After some experimenting, it turned out that was the best way to do it. The armholes and neck hole were left exactly the same. I just needed to make the body and the shoulders a bit wider, so adding those 10 stitches was the easiest way to do that. The shirt I'm wearing there is another one of the shirts I made for myself. It's a very simple pattern. It's a fairly modern pattern, but it is supposed to be a historical square shirt. It's close, but not 100% accurate. It's fairly comfortable. I might do a video on that in the future. Let me know if you'd like to see that. A lot of the recording of the knitting was just this. And that was another thing that made it difficult. How do you make a repetitive motion like this entertaining? I don't want to use music on my videos. I encourage people to put their own music on. So that makes it a little bit trickier. And after a while, it's time to turn the thing round, and instead of doing... Hold on, which way am I here? I was either doing a knit or a purl row before. I think it might have been a purl row, and I think this might be... Yes, this is a knit row, so this is where I pick up the coloured yarn from the previous coloured section. Now, the way that I do it, you can see with that orange yarn there, is I tie the two coloured yarns together and leave quite a long tail. But I don't knit that tail in, I will deal with that later on. And when you start your new row, you just have to watch that your tension's not too tight, because that colour has to bridge the gap with the previous black stripe. And then you get to the end of the row, and it's time to switch over again. So you turn the whole thing around, and you can see here you've got some of those loose tails, and that's from the previous stripes that have been done. You just keep going. It's just plain stockinette stitch on this one, so the interest in the design is really in the stripes. The other one that I've done uses a really nice hand-dyed merino wool, and it's all variegated. It's very pretty. Definitely not one for wearing when I'm grubbing about in cars. Looks like that's the end of the yellow row. Yeah, so we snip off the excess there so that we can get ready for attaching our new colour. But looks like I decided to go straight ahead and do the black here for some reason. Normally I do tie the new colour on before I go. So every one of these stripes is 2 rows. This means that when you've got all your loose ends, they're all at one side of the garment. It also means that you don't have to break the black thread so often, because the black thread you're always going to be back where you started every time you change colours. So you can just use the black continually. It gives you a bit less work. And we're now at the end of the row. I'm not going to torture you with having to watch every single row and every single stitch. It would be too long. The footage for this video that I'd taken over the last 2.5 weeks was around about 3 hours, so I slimmed it down quite a lot. So here I am joining on the coloured thread that I should have joined on before doing the black stripe. All you do, it's a standard granny knot or double knot, and you leave the tails nice and long. We'll deal with those later. And then you just have to make sure that the thread that you're picking up is the thread that you want to work with. Try not to pick up one of your tails or the wrong colour. And it's just repeat and repeat. The nice thing is, because you're constantly doing something different with getting these different colours in and picking the colour that you want, I did try and make sure that there were no two coloured stripes the same, one after another, so I wanted to keep it very varied. It gives you that little bit extra interest, so you don't get bored of doing it, because stockinette can be quite boring for an entire garment. This is a nice way to give some variety to the work you're doing. So here we go. This is the oatmeal type wool I'm using, and these are my number 8 ace needles. Those are the ones that I use for doing the casting on, which is what I'm doing here. So when I'd finished doing the front, I didn't record the shaping of it or anything. I'd got too far with it to actually do that. Lack of forward planning. Anyway, this is me casting on just out of shot, because I'm still getting used to knitting on camera. And when you're casting on, it's just the same as doing a knit row. So you're coming through your existing loop, and you go round as usual, and then you pick your stitch up, but rather than taking it over onto your right hand needle, you put it back on the left hand needle, and then you do it again until you have enough. The pattern originally calls for 98 stitches cast on. Of course, we're adding 10, so that's 108. You then will switch from that to a knit 1 purl 1 rib for 3.5 inches. Once you've done your 3.5 inches, and before you change, in this case, to the stripe yarns, you do increase the number of stitches. If you get hold of the pattern, you'll see exactly how it's done. I'm not going to read out the entire pattern to you, but you increase it so that you end up going from your 98 stitches up to 105, just checking. And that means that the band around the bottom just fits a little bit snugly around the hips, and you don't get this thing where if you don't have the ribbing on the bottom, it kind of flares out. It looks a bit weird. I've got a waistcoat that does this. It's got no darts in it, so it hangs sort of straight down from the chest, but it does this weird triangular looking thing because of the shape of your body. So that's what this is, I think, to avoid. And it also gives you that nice sort of almost like a shirt tucked into a belt kind of a look. You don't see it so much with modern machine knitted stuff these days. So there you go, that's the first little bit of the casting on done, and I'm just counting to check how many I've got. I quite like casting on. I don't know what it is about it. It's just, I think it's one of the first things I learned with knitting, and there was just something satisfying about making this great big long chain and then taking it off the needle and just pulling it and watching it all unravel. I mean, it's not as satisfying now when you're trying to do a project and it slips off the needle because you haven't put quite enough tension on, but when I was first starting, it was fun. I wasn't very old at the time, so yeah. I learned how to knit from my late gran. She used to do it for pin money, as she used to call it, and yeah, she was fast. Here we go, just counting, making sure I've got the right number. I've sped this up a little bit. I tend to count in pairs, makes it easier for me to figure it out. And once I'm happy with how many I've got, I could then go on and do the ribbed section. So The needles you switch to after the rib section are number 7s. In this case, they are both arrows, but they're different ages, so they're a different design. For some reason, they're the only pair of 7s I have. So that's the 3.5-inch ribbed section at the bottom, which will become the belt, and then that's the first few rows of colour in the various different acrylics that I've got here. The black that's the main of the body is quite a grabby yarn. It doesn't slide on the needles very nice, and that fluffy grey line, that one's a self-colouring one, so it stripes as you knit it up. That one has the opposite problem, where it slips off the needles really far too fast. It's quite an annoying combination, but I persevered. After all, we're using leftovers for this. That blue, as it happens, is one of the nicest ones I had. I think that became part of a blanket. This would be either later the same day or the next day. And you can see I've got the shaping for the arms there, so you just cast off as the pattern says. You don't change the number of stitches. The armholes and the neck holes remained exactly the same, and it fit perfectly fine. And here's a bit of a close-up of how this all knits. You can see with the fluffy wool how it's slightly thicker, so it does kind of bunch up a little bit. If this was a regular garment that I was wearing and wanted it to look nice, I wouldn't have done it this way. Since this is essentially work clothes, it suits what I need it to do. And as it happened, after it was put through the wash, it evened out. So you have to remember that when you actually knit a garment up, washing it and blocking it does make quite a bit of difference. So after we've done most of the back and all of the front, we don't have a lot left. I was finding it tricky to balance these colours out because I didn't want to end up with too many patches of one kind of colour, and that self-coloured fluffy wool proved to be a nuisance again because you couldn't always predict which colour was going to come up because it's all leftovers on there. So another angle, trying to figure this out a bit better. I'm trying to show almost how the knitting looks when you're working on it. So when I get the tension on the wool, I've tried various ways over the years, and this is the one that seems to be sticking at the moment, is I loop it around my middle finger and then either just my ring finger or my ring finger and my pinky finger. And that seems to help keep a very even tension. So this is a pearl row, so I'm just showing how you go through with your thread there, with your yarn. I don't know about you, if you're a knitter watching this, but for some reason I find pearl stitches very, very quick, and knit stitches I find to be a bit of a nuisance. I can never do a knit row as fast as I do a pearl row, and I've never figured out why doing pearl rows is so much easier. Perhaps it's the way I hold the needles. I don't know, it's always been like that. My gran was the other way around. My gran found that knit rows were always a much easier thing for her to do than pearl rows, but then she tended to hold the needles under her elbows, and I've never got the hang of that. I've never been able to do that without accidentally pulling half a dozen stitches off the needles. So maybe it's down to the style of knitting that is comfortable for me. That's worth mentioning too. When you knit, there isn't really any one way that suits every single person. Every knitter I've known knits slightly differently. And it's not a men and a women knitters thing either. It just seems to be every single knitter has a different way that knitting fits their particular body. So when you get people saying you're doing that wrong, chances are you're not. Chances are you're just doing it the way that's comfortable for you. And what they actually mean is there might be a slightly better method. So here we are. This is what you end up with after a few rows. You have all these tails, which we will be sorting out in a bit. And you can see where the black goes over the pink there. When you're actually going between the different colours, you need to make sure that your tension is right. So you'll feel it better when you do it, but basically when you pick up your new thread, you need it to bridge the gap of the previous 2 rows. Because every single colour, I tie them on at the end of every single row. And that's me getting the tension on for this stitch. So if you pull it too tight, what happens is you squash all of that side up, and then you'll end up with no way of getting it back normal again. So you have to be very, very careful of the tension on the ends when you do this sort of knitting. Here you're seeing some of the difficulty I have with these 2 particular yarns. The black is very grabby, and the green, which is that fluffy self-colouring wool, is very slippy. So I did find I was having to push the point of the needle with my left index finger a lot more, and that gets quite uncomfortable. So I did try to avoid using this fluffy wool there it goes. This fluffy wool as much as I could. I was so close to the end of the row I didn't bother picking it up. I just let it roll around on the floor. Normally I keep my wool in a little bowl or in a bag by my side to control it. Let's speed it up a bit. Get to the end. I really like the way the back of this looks. A lot of people really hate the way garter stitch... Is garter stitch on the back? Anyway, a lot of people hate how that looks, but I'm really fond of it. After some more time, the back is finished. Armhole shaped, shoulders shaped. There's not really any shaping to the neck. It's very, very simple on the back, which is nice. Just laid out on my computer desk here. It's the one space I had with good light that was big enough. Another flyover of the knitting, just so you get to see some of the variation a lot closer than you would do normally. Again, a shot of the back there. I really do like that. It's just such a shame that we think of it as a piece of clothing inside out when we see that side. So now with the main body pieces made up, the attention needs to turn to tidying up all of these loose tails that are everywhere. And there's a number of different ways to do it, but I wanted something that was going to be quick and basic and not require too much effort. So for this one I'm using a middling sized crochet hook. I just picked up whatever fit easiest through the stitches. All you do is, as you go down the edge where the loose edge is, you just go through, well, any part of a stitch that is suitable, and you hook the loose threads and just pull them through, as you can see I'm doing here. It's very quick, and you end up with a fairly tidy seam. Again, be careful of your tension with this one. You only really want to be tidying these loose ends up. You don't want to be pulling everything tight. So as you go, when you're doing this, it helps every inch or two to just gently ease the knitting out to where it feels like it wants to be naturally. You might find some of the loose tails end up appearing again, but that's not really a problem. As long as you go through and you tidy the majority of them away, the rest can either be trimmed, or you can just get the crochet hook and pull them through again, and it will just make everything tidied out the way. The seam does end up looking a little bit bulky compared to the rest of your knitting, but it doesn't feel it when the garment's on. Unless you're making something very form-fitted, this method works perfectly fine. You can see there's quite a bit to go. Sometime later, I've now done all of the edges, and as I say, you do just have to be careful of the tension. You can see how it's a little bit wavy. That's the different thicknesses of the yarn that's caused that. Where there isn't so much variation, it's actually quite smooth. And this is now ready to be sewn together and turned into a proper garment. It's very, very close to finished at this stage. I started this project about 2.5 weeks. Yeah, I would say 2.5 weeks from start to finish. It is about right. So it was a bit of a push to get it out for the video on time. I wasn't really planning on doing this one, but the other item that I was planning on doing for various reasons didn't come to fruition. So I've sewn the shoulders and the sides together. On this particular pattern, it doesn't suggest to do it Kitchener style, and I'm using a circular needle. Again, I don't have the size that I want in double pointed needles, so I'm going to have to use a circular. I am not a fan of circular needles. We need to pick up 120 stitches, and the stripes help a little bit with this. So to pick up the stitches, it's like casting on, really, except what you're doing is you're picking up a stitch from the body of the garment, and then you're knitting through it and moving the stitch over onto your right hand needle from the left. So it's sort of halfway between casting on and knitting, and it's a bit tricky to get the hang of to begin with, but once you get the hang of it, it's really easy. It makes a very strong seam when you're done as well, because there's nothing to come unravelled. It's just knitting that's knitted to other knitting. The stripes help because I know each stripe is 2 rows, so I can count the number of stripes that I've got, which, as it happened, was just shy of 30, and I knew I needed to pick up 60 stitches for that area. That is for the front and for the back. So I knew I could just go down and pick up every single stitch, and then when you get to the bottom of the armhole where you've got a cast off row, there's around about, I think it's 5 or 6 stitches accessible. I'd have to count it to be sure. So you just have to space that one out based on what you've got on the circular needle. Again, it's one of these things where you literally pick it up as you go along, and you do it by feel. The first couple of times I did these, I ended up having to unravel it several times until I figured out the feel of it. And now it's fairly straightforward. For the neck, as it happens, I didn't cover the neck in this video. It is 60 down each front of the V, and then 20 across the back of the neck. And that one's a bit harder because the back of the neck is a lot more than 20 stitches. So there's a little bit of maths involved in that. I think it was 1 every 1.6 stitches. Anyway, here I am at the bottom, and this is where the purple there is the cast off section. So I'm just picking up stitches from the edge of the cast off. And once I've got up to 60, and once they're all spaced fairly evenly, we get to the seam, and then I know I can start counting to 60 again to go up the other side. These armholes don't take very long to do. The longest part of the job really is just this section. There we go. That's the 60 all the way down to the seam. You'll notice as well there, I haven't tried to match up the colours of the stripes down the side. The black does match, but the other stripes, I'm using leftover yarn. There's only so much you can do. So the other side that we have to do is where we've tied all those loose ends in, and it's just the same process. Just be careful when you do that side that you're not accidentally picking up the loose ends. So once you've picked up your 120 stitches, you then just knit in the round. I've left the tail off, you can just see it underneath my hand there. as my marker to tell me where the end of the seam is. The actual seam on the garment helps as well. And you do a knit 1, purl 1 rib for 7 rows. And this is why I don't like circular needles. They're always the wrong size, so you're always fighting with the circular needle and the stitches being too tight on it, and the loop you pull through to try and shorten it, as I've done here, gets in the way, especially when they're plastic ones. This is a part of the project I did not enjoy, unfortunately, but it was worth it for the end result. Once you've done 7 rows, you then cast off in the rib, and that's the armholes done. Let's see it in action. I needed to see if the princess would start, but the battery was flat, so it was an ideal opportunity to try out this top, make sure that it works. I'm using the Maestro to help out. They're both kind of noisy, they're old cars. Well, I'd say that was a success. I'm going to disconnect the jump leads and put them away back in their little bag. Which can take a while. And yeah, it's happy enough. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I do like to read them.